Chapter 2. Clinton to Rochester. On Monday, Mr. and Mrs. Maltby returned home, and on Wednesday morning, Mrs. Davis, with my mother and myself, set off in an immense green wagon with Mr. Morven of Clinton for Syracuse, 40 miles distance. We passed through the towns of Conestoga, Canaseraga, Chittenango, Manlius, and Oneida, etc. At Orville, we turned off from the high road to visit Messina Springs, about 3 miles from Syracuse. As we descended a hill, the bolt of our wagon came out, and the whipple tree hitting against the horses' legs frightened them prodigiously. They ran down the hill with great violence and halfway up a steep bank on the left of the side of the road. The crisis was a fearful one, for should they gain the bank, which led up a steep precipice to the road, destruction seemed inevitable. Mother was breathless with emotion, and Mrs. Davis was preparing to take a leap over the wheels when Mr. Marvin fortunately succeeded in reining in the terrified animals against the fence. Mrs. Davis was on the ground as quick as thought, and Mother, panting and agonizing, prepared to follow her, but I besought her to be calm and sit still, assuring her the danger was over, as Mr. Marvin had disengaged the animals from the wagon. But like the woman on the fable, she was afraid the gun would go off, even without lock, stock, or barrel. However, by reiterated asseverations and a most timely recurrence to the thought that she could not alight upon the earth with the dexterity of a spirit, and again reascend the ponderous vehicle, but was a veritable mixture, and that no tiny one of earth's mold, she was prevailed upon to maintain her station. And now I could moralize at length upon the necessity of persevering presence of mind in such emergency, and upon the almost universal want of it, did such strain befit a journal. Query, how far may it be cultivated? This is a question we would do well to ponder on and practice. We were soon righted, and pursued our way to Messina to taste and respire the sulphuretted gas of the odious spring. It was so repugnant to Mother's olfactories and mine that we did not quaff it, but our companions drank several glasses. It appears to be a place unknown to fame, if we might judge by the number of visitors. The springs bubble up in a solitary place, and the water is conducted through a penstock into the premises of the solitary landlord of Messina Springs. We saw one young girl, a poor victim of inflammatory rheumatism, who said the waters were doing her essential service. The price of boarding was $3 per week, even in these solitudes, and the host was thinking its remarkable cheapness was the reason his house was not fuller. We assured him we thought it was quite high enough to suit the most fastidious, and departed, wending our way to Syracuse. This pretty town, with a beautiful extent of country directly before us, bounded by Onondaga Hill and the bright smooth lake of the same name 2 or 3 miles off at the right, was spread out to view as we descended a steep hill directly in the rear of the town. We passed through a new street which appeared to have been recently opened, but was lined on the right hand by several beautiful white dwellings, with porticos in front, about which were tastefully arranged the flowers of the soil, now luxuriant freshness, and exotics of other climes, embracing each other and mingling their sweet odors in the most intimate union. Mother and I had proposed to go to the Syracuse house, but stopping to leave Mrs. Davis at the door of Mrs. Nedville, our niece, and an old acquaintance of ours, we were so politely pressed to come in and take tea that we accepted. Henry and Thomas Davis soon heard of their mother's arrival and came to greet us. This last young man had grown up since I saw him, had been engaged to be married to one every way qualified to make him happy, and within a few weeks of their anticipated union the lady of his affection died. Henry, the elder son, married an only child of a widowed mother, beautiful as our brightest fancies, but she soon sickened, and for 18 months has been laid a helpless and almost hopeless invalid upon a bed of suffering. So we are betrayed by the ignis fatui of youthful fancy. The roses of life look bright and gorgeous in the distance. We hasten to pluck them and make their beauty and their fragrance ours, but we no sooner have them in our bosom than their rich hues are faded, and the small thorns which were before hidden among the silken foliage now annoy and wound us. And such is human life. Happy they who choose the perennial flowers which grow by the fountain of everlasting life, whose fruit will be eaten in the paradise of God. In the evening, Mrs. Nedville sent for Mrs. Mary of Green Bay to come in and see us. a pretty little woman who is waiting here in the hope that her husband will obtain a furlough and come after her. She speaks in animated terms of the pleasant society of Navarino. Mrs. Netfield easily prevailed upon us to stay with her all night, and in the morning, after a most affectionate farewell from Mrs. Davis, we set off in the stage at 6 o'clock and passed through Geddes, Camillus, Wheatsport to Auburn, 25 miles. This place, as well as the rest through which we have traveled, had increased most astonishingly since I passed through it about 10 years since. It now, if I mistaken not, contains as many as 200,000 inhabitants, and I should think was a place of a considerable business. It contains a theological seminary, and the state prison is quite a beautiful and imposing building. We remained in Auburn about 3 hours, and during the time walked out to find Mr. Wilson's family. We made a short call upon them, found Mrs. W. still very much of an invalid, and her only son a cripple. They gave us a kind welcome, and Mr. W. returned with us to the hotel, where we soon took stage for Geneva. The roads were excessively dusty, and we felt disappointed that our route today did not lie through the beautiful village of Schenectady, with its picturesque and translucent lake. We crossed the mile bridge over Cayuga Lake, which seemed almost interminable, and Mother thought very frail, plowed through the deep sand which came rising upon us in volumes, so that we could be said to bite the dust as truly as any of Homer's heroes. A heavy shower of rain allayed this, however, and we passed around the head of the lovely lake of Seneca and entered the charming village of Geneva, which is spread out in all the beauty of luxuriant gardens and tasteful dwellings upon its verdant shore. We alighted at the Franklin House, and the landlord showed us to a nice and spacious apartment, very genteelly furnished, with everything that we could desire for our comfort, and which led out upon a piazza directly overlooking the blue and delicious waters. We shook off as much of the accumulated dust of our journey as possible, and after having washed and brushed and perfumed, we were soon summoned to tea. It was excellent, and in descending to the table I met a quondam seminary acquaintance, Miss Margaret Hubbard, of Middletown, Connecticut. She introduced us to the party she was with, Mr. and Mrs. Gould of New York, a young married pair, and Miss Hubbard of Utica. We found them very genteel, agreeable people, and consented to join them in procuring an extra stage to convey us to Rochester the following morning at 9 o'clock. In the meantime, I had dispatched a note to Mr. Thompson to apprise him of our presence in Geneva, and in the evening he came in the rain to see us. The identical Timothy of former days, not a whit changed. He begged us to remain a few days in this beautiful village, that he might exhibit it to us in all its minutiae loveliness, its terraced gardens, cultivated with the most exquisite taste and redolent with the flowers of almost every clime. We would gladly have given one circuit of the sun to this delightful place, and the memory of other times so intimately associated with our polite cicerone and his agreeable companion, but the promise just made to our fellow travelers forbade it, and all we could do was to engage to ride hastily with them about the village in the morning. The morning came, and a lovelier never dawned. The rain of the night had touched with a deeper tint of green the rich foliage of the forest and garden, and sprinkled them with thousands of dewy drops, by which the magic touch of the sunbeam was converted into jewelry, so that every leaf was fringed with diamonds, and every blade of grass trembled and scintillated like a glittering star. We gazed upon the scene with rapture. The lake before us winding lay, with promontory, creek, and bay, and islands that empurpled bright floated amid the livelier light. We could not see in its softened and solemn loveliness at eventide, when the pure and pale moon throws her chaste veil over the gorgeous drapery of day, wrapping all things in beauty, but we could imagine its touching and subduing influence. How sweet at eve would lover's lute chime when the groves were still and mute, and when her forehead she did lave at midnight in the silver wave, how solemn on the ear would come the holy matin's distant hum. Our party was so impatient to be off that it was with difficulty we could gain time for a hasty ride with Mr. Thompson, but we took it even at the risk of offending, and spent the morning after breakfast until 9 in admiring the quiet and rural beauty of Geneva. There is no towering mountain or wild ravine to awe with its sublimity or appall with its fearfulness, but there is everything of luxuriance and softness and tranquillity to attract admiration. The place, I should suppose, contains about 6,000 inhabitants, and I am told the society is excellent. After we returned from our ride, Mr. Thompson very politely purchased some fine oranges to treat us with, and at about 9:30 we bade him adieu and took our stage for Rochester. We passed the beautiful lake of Shenandoah, in Indian significance the chosen place, and rode through the principal street of its village. It looks smaller than Geneva, but very far exceeds in its architectural beauty. The house of Mr. Gregg is said to be the only place in the country, but our companions were in such haste to proceed that we could only have such a view of the town as we could procure from riding hastily through it in the stage, and I was induced to depreciate parties and extras, as in this case the only advantage we gained was the payment of nearly $3 extra price. We passed through a little town and arrived at Rochester about 5 o'clock. The stage took us to Mr. Ely's, and to our dismay we found Mrs. Ely was absent in New York. We were kindly welcomed by her niece, Miss Catherine Sargent, and Emily Ely, who was out when we reached there but soon came home, and by her cordial reception placed us very much at our ease. We found an abundance of delicious fruit at Mr. Ely's, such as apricots, plums, gooseberries, and apples, and we were very much amused by the inquisitiveness and precocity of his adopted son, Samuel Ely. He seemed to think it utterly wrong and selfish that a man at his marriage should always insist upon the woman's taking his name. He saw no reason for it, and for his part he should not practice it. Mr. Ely was exceedingly kind and polite in his attentions to us, and on Saturday procured us a barouche that we might ride around and view the town and visit the Genesee Falls about a mile above the town. Rochester has increased surprisingly within 10 years. It contains nearly 200,000 inhabitants and does an immense deal of business. There are some handsome dwelling houses and a few pleasant streets. The general aspect of the place, however, is not very agreeable to me. It contains 2 flourishing Episcopal churches. One of them, St. Paul's, has the tallest spire I think that I ever saw. It is built of dark stone and is altogether a beautiful building. The falls are exceedingly picturesque. There is at present but little water, and so perfectly white and foaming that it looks like flakes of the purest snow, falling lightly and gracefully in the sunbeams from a height of about 90 feet, if my memory does not deceive me. The river is of a very considerable width, and the banks on both sides 100 feet in depth of solid rock, and worn in such ridges by the retreating water that they look as if artificially hewn. This must have been in former ages a giant river with a rapid and resistless current. The ledge of rock which forms the cataract is semicircle, and when the water is high it must present a grand and imposing aspect. Here was where Sam Patch enacted his final tragedy, a sad instance of the wildness and extravagance of human folly. We visited the famous bridge at Carthage, which was thrown in one high arc from bank to bank, and fell with a thundering crash just after a trio of little children had passed, thus confirming the belief that angels have charged over them. We also visited the landing plain, about 3 miles above Rochester, where the steamboat comes to bring her passengers from Lake Ontario. Here we saw immense weights ascend and descend from railroads to the height of 1,000 feet, almost perpendicular by means of the inclined plane acted upon by 2 large wheels, the one horizontal, which was moved by a horse, and the other one, a perpendicular, moved by the first wheel. To this last was appended a chain, which, while it let one car gently down the inclined plane, drew up another. In the afternoon I called to see Mrs. Sam Miller and Mrs. Levitt. I found the husband of the latter looking like a hypochondriac, and just prepared to feast upon whortleberries and milk. Mrs. Levitt looked old and careworn, and it is only when I meet with these companions of my childhood that I realize the ravages which time has made upon my own exterior, using their countenances as a mirror by which I may view my own. Mr. Matthews and his daughter called in the evening to invite us to accompany them to church the following morning. The Sunday came. It was a cold day, but I trust it found our hearts warmed with some little gratitude to the God who had so kindly protected all our wanderings. Mr. Ely is an eminently pious man, and I hoped the fervor of his devout and holy life might quicken my languid and sluggish piety. We went with our neighbors and Miss Ely at the hour of worship to St. Luke's Church. The services were conducted by Mr. Allen with the most uncompromising elocution. But the services of the church have this advantage, that whatever may be the defects of reading or elocution, their intrinsic value is the same, always reverent, always devotional, always elevating. The difficulty is to raise the feeling of our cold hearts to the measure of fervor which the prayers evince. The most exalted piety and the most rapturous devotion will find language there suited to its highest flights. Dr. Whitehouse, the rector of the parish, preached to us from the text, "Grieve not the Spirit." He addressed himself to all classes and every age in language the most appropriate and beautiful, and with the manner most felicitously adapted to win the attention and captivity of the mind. Nor was his excellencies confined to externals only, but his sermon was full of pious teaching and holy exhortation. He emphatically preached the gospel. Mother and myself were both fascinated, and in the afternoon, while Mother went with Mr. Ely to the Presbyterian Church, out of compliment to him, I could not deny myself the delightful privileges of again listening to the pure precepts of the gospel as administered by this faithful disciple of the cross. His subject was now the mysterious temptation of St. Paul, the thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet him. Dr. Whitehouse seemed to agree with the hint thrown out by one of Miss H. Moore's correspondents, that the trial was purely physical, confined to the body. This he inferred from many texts of Scripture, which he quoted, although he did not attempt to affirm its nature precisely. He called on all, young and old, men and women, to go forward, as St. Paul did in the service of the Lord, with his zeal and steadfastness and faith, and with the assurance that God's grace would be sufficient for them under any circumstance of temptation and affliction. The evening found us both again listening to the eloquence of Dr. Whitehouse in a stated exposition of Scripture, it being this evening the first verses of the 2nd chapter of Hebrews. He was again eloquent and excellent, and we have both come to the conclusion that he is not surpassed by any clergyman in the church. He is said to be untiring in his parochial labors, as well as surpassingly excellent in the pulpit. He has been a most successful minister and is devotedly attached to his people, having recently refused a call to St. Mark's Church, New York, with a salary of $3,500. Here he receives $2,000. On Monday morning at about 12 o'clock, we were earnestly looking out for a call from our delightful preacher, having been told that he would come and see us. Sister Harriet and her husband drove up. She entered the very door of the room before we knew her, but as soon as she was recognized, caresses of recognition and love were liberally bestowed. They came back in a barouche, intending to take Mother and I back with them, but as we had previously engaged to visit Mrs. Sam Miller, and as I was desirous to receive the announced visit from Dr. Whitehouse, I concluded to remain until tomorrow, retaining Harriet, and let my mother go with Henry to Brockport. They took leave of us at 4 o'clock, and while Harriet and myself were busily engaged in examining Mrs. Ely's West Indian herbarium, Mr. Matthews and Dr. Whitehouse were announced. He was as agreeable as could be expected in a first interview, and for the short space of half an hour, and I, like a little fool, was in such fluster that I could not speak without the hard swallow. He was exceedingly polite and kindly offered to take any steps which would promote the pleasure of our journey. He said he expected Dr. Milner to go through Lake Erie shortly, and he would speak to him or write to him of our movements if we desired. I gave him no encouragement to do so, however, not knowing at what time we might depart upon our voyage, and furthermore thinking I should be once again in Rochester during my visit to Brockport. In the evening we visited Mrs. Miller, who had invited guests to meet us, and a stiffer party I was never in. However, it came to an end, as all things do, and we returned to Mr. Ely's, and the two sisters, after having been separated for nearly a 12-month, again reposed in sisterly embrace and mingled their reminiscence and their hopes in sisterly and confided intercourse.